Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Leadership Reimagined, Developing Leaders to Enable Culture Shifts in Your Organization. Just going to take a moment to introduce our guests for today. Margo Hoyt is the Managing Director and Senior Vice President of LHH's Talent and Leadership Development Practice. She's been working in the leadership and organizational development space for more than 30 years. Margo has worked extensively in organizational transformation and change and consults with leaders and teams to enhance their effectiveness and make shifts for the future. She'll be joined by Cara Danielson, Senior Vice President, Leadership Development Programs. An accomplished coach and mentor, Cara brings more than 15 years of expertise in designing and implementing innovative approaches to the development and measurement of talent management programs for clients across a wide range of industry sectors. I'm Amalia Jimenez, a VP in the Talent and Leadership Development Practice, and today we'll be sharing our insights and experiences partnering with clients as we navigate how to lead and align culture in these difficult times. We're going to start with a poll. What aspect of your culture will you focus on enhancing next? Just select one option, please. Demonstrating empathy and compassion, adaptability, collaboration regardless of location, diversity and inclusion, and a focus on results. Take a minute and select the one that is what your organization will be focusing on in the near future. Are coming in. We still need a little bit of time. And once they're all in, we're going to get Cara to do a little bit of a debrief for us on what she sees. All right.
Thanks, Amalia. Well, the results are coming in. Let's just have a brief discussion around what we're seeing. Not sure if there's any surprises for you. I think, let's just talk about the different categories. So demonstrating empathy and compassion is about 12%, is one of the areas that you're going to be focusing on. Adaptability is sitting at about 20%. Collaboration is about 28%. Diversity and inclusion is 32%. And focusing on results is about 7%. I think that's really interesting as we're meeting and having conversations with our clients. I think that these results are certainly lining up and aligning to those. Margo, any surprises for you?
It's always interesting to see, and thanks and hello to everybody. 6, 8, 10 months ago, would we have seen such a difference between the focus on results and where it sits in these priorities and where we're seeing it today? I think there's lots of conversation to be had and a focus even of the hour that we have together here, Cara, around how, what we're focusing on is shifting. And it's really some of the softer side of leadership that's emerging as most important and where we as organizations need to support our leaders most.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll be a really interesting conversation today, and we'll talk a little bit more upcoming around some of the soft skills and what are the areas we're seeing organizations focus on, and they certainly are indicative of the results that just showed up on the screen. So before we get into those questions, Margo, we'll hand it over to you, and I know you have some information that you're going to share with us now. Over to you.
Thanks so much. And welcome to everybody here today. What we wanted to do is start by sharing some of the insights or themes or observations that we've had over the last several weeks and months, in particular around culture and leadership. As we work our way through, yet again, these unprecedented times and into this next era, I think it's important for us to pause and really think about, what are we doing around the areas of culture and leadership, and how will it make a difference for us as we move forward? So let's get started with that. As we look at the next slide, the first point on this slide, and Molly, I'll just get you to move that forward, is around culture and leadership are central to success. I'm going to make a guess that there are a lot of people on the call today or on the webinar today who are in people leadership roles, culture leadership roles, human resources, human capital, organizational development, or leadership roles. You already know that culture and leadership are central. But if we take a look back over the last couple of months, we've seen that without a playbook, organizations who've had really strong cultures that are really aligned on their priorities from a values perspective and on who they want to be and who they are as organizations, have been able to react very quickly. And that's resulted in engagement scores going up, right? Of course, people are very happy to have jobs in some cases where they see their neighbors having lost theirs. But we also know that employees are very appreciative of this quick reaction and this quick focus that's aligned with their values and what they've known their organization to have as values. So those touchstones, Cara, that, that real interest in what is culture has been stellar. And it's also helped, I think, for leaders to be able across the organization to know how to react and what to do, because it's been clear to them what's most important. We've seen organizations that have, strong community values know that they want to give back. Those that are really all about their people and their teams and how they've supported employees and made decisions about restructuring and the way forward. So lots to be said about the power of culture, how it's helped us so far. And then shifting as we think about where we're going next, how important it'll be to future-proof. We don't know exactly what's around the corner. The crystal balls are not yet available on Amazon that work, at least. So when we think about how are we preparing our organizations for the future, the continued focus on values and culture and how leaders can bring those to life, I think is just going to be paramount, and that's what we're hearing. The second point that you see up here on the screen that I'll start with is around, our culture is shifting. Of course it is. Cultures always shift. But what's interesting is how intentional are we able to be on how those cultures are shifting, because things are happening really fast around us. Right now we're seeing our environments shift and our context shift personally and professionally. So undoubtedly the culture of our organizations are going to shift, and it's the intentionality of how that happens that I think will be really interesting. Those organizations that were already focused on adaptability and agility will have been proud and perhaps not surprised at how quickly they've shifted. But as they think about going forward, what it says about our culture through how we address the reality of workplace stress, mental health, and burnout. In so many of our conversations with HR leaders and executives, that's a real concern today. And it'll say a lot, intentionally or not intentionally, about our culture, how we react to those issues. The convergence of crises. We saw the importance of diversity and inclusive leadership in that first poll. We have real social unrest. We have challenges with racism and the Black Lives Matters movement at the same time as we have a pandemic. So again, it'll say a lot about our culture, about how we react to that. How intentional are we being? Our workplaces are mixed between at home and potentially working in an office building again. So all of these things are important, how we focus on results, even if it's the fifth in all of those priorities. We know there still has to be some focus on results, but at the same time showing empathy for the individual. So all of that going to say, our organizational cultures will shift, but the questions that come up are about how intentional can we be? Do we have the capacity to direct those shifts and the pace at which they happen? And without some of the, the traditional approaches to shifting culture through face-to-face interactions in the hallways and more formally, will we be able to make the kind of collective shifts to culture that we really want to make? And how will that need to shift? But that's the second thing around culture and leadership that I think we've really had lots of good conversations about and are going to be important for organizations to continue to work through. Just continuing along the theme, if your culture is shifting, the next one is really about how the leadership requirements need to shift along with that. And that's near and dear to our hearts as we work so closely with organizations on their leadership development programs and coaching and supporting leaders. Leadership is what sets the tone for culture. It's what brings it to life. And we're seeing such a shift in away from some of the technical sides of things right now to things like the adaptability and agility. Not new words in the vocabulary. There have been lots of speak to that in competency models and frameworks and leadership requirements in the past, but certainly a more consistent focus on this across organizations and a need for it. Resilience. Wow, we've been through so much. And optimism about how we're going to continue to make it through the next stages and phases of our current reality. Emotional intelligence, again, something that we've heard lots about in the past, but how that's being translated into empathy for each individual who reports to us. has never been more important. Really understanding their personal context. Do they have kids at home? Are they worried about elders in care homes? What is the isolation meaning for them, or their capacity to work 24/7 potentially? So, you know, these are the things that we're seeing required from leaders in an even more exaggerated a way. So many of the organizations we're talking to, it's not just about communication, which has always been important, but how do you express vulnerability and authenticity through the lens of a camera attached to your computer monitor? How do you demonstrate inclusion when you can't wrap your arms around each other, when you can't even shake a hand? There's lots for us to learn. There's lots for us to continue to focus on. And these are just some of the ways that we're seeing the requirements of leaders shift and need to continue to evolve. They're reimagining what leadership really needs to be all about. The next couple of aspects or insights that I wanted to share and put that there up front so that we can use this to fuel the conversation and the questions that come in for us are a little more tactical maybe, or a little more pointed. This one around coaching capabilities are essential is really interesting. You know, we're one of the world's largest coaching organizations. LHH has coaches in 63 countries. We have had conversations for years and decades about the importance of virtual coaching, face-to-face coaching, building coaching cultures, teaching coaching curriculums, but never has it been of more interest to our clients to build this type of capability. And I guess it makes sense when you just talk about the kinds of requirements that we're looking for from our leaders, that the skills that are associated with coaching would therefore be that much more important. You know, we're talking about the foundational skills of being strong listeners, really being able to listen to each individual, what their context is, what they're saying and what they're not saying. An incredibly important coaching skill, an incredibly important leadership skill in today's context. Individuals are losing control. The coaching conversations can really help to give back some controls, to empower individuals to find their way forward. We can't possibly, you know, have a command and control directive type of culture or approach to leadership when we're distributed in multiple locations, and we need to really be, you know, stepping up to our personal accountabilities. So that's a skill that will be absolutely, you know, important, and empowering people, asking the right questions and helping them to find their way, and then holding them accountable to actually execute on those paths. These are foundational skills that, you know, really our organizations, our clients are really looking for. And I think it's fascinating that, you know, when you start to really focus in on those coaching capabilities, how it can really support and bolster so many of the other leadership requirements that organizations are looking to build. And the final one, before we start to get into some further conversation and dialogue, is just around virtual leadership development being effective. And this is one that's really, you know, it's personal to us. We're in the leadership development business. We've been doing virtual leadership development for a long time. And so many of our conversations over the last few months have been about how can that be effective in our organization. And there are lots of you out there who've been incorporating or fully dependent on virtual leadership development. And you could probably help us to write the book about how it can work and how it can work really well. But for others, this sense of, look, my culture is changing. What we require from our leaders is changing, and yet we don't have really great strategies or approaches to support leaders to react to that, to be their best, to continue to evolve, to support the organization. And I guess what I just wanted to share is that there's lots of terrific experiences out there with really effective virtual leadership development programs to help you. And we've seen clients really struggle with this, and of course, you know, early on there was no interest in it. There were more important things to deal with. But I want to paint a picture of hope and optimism that, you know, there is a way forward, and we're really pleased to be seeing that so many people are embracing how technology can support this, how different types of facilitation, how we can create learning journeys. And that's a phrase that Cara speaks I would say almost every minute of every day, about the power of a leadership journey that, you know, you can really embrace and you can have success in this way forward. So I'm going to pause there. And Cara, I know that you've been having lots of conversations with clients and in the industry of late as well. Anything you want to add to that before we start to take some questions?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add and echo really all the things that you've said. I think what's really important for us to recognize, and we're going to talk a little bit about it in some upcoming questions, we'll dive deeper around really what those leadership requirements are continuing to evolve to. There was a long list on the page there that Margo went through, and they certainly are all critical, but I think there's some that are really critical to focus on quite quickly as we think about what's required in the workplace around leadership support. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The virtual leadership development is, as Margo indicated, is near and dear to my heart. And the good news is, I think, as an organization, we were doing this long before COVID happened, and we realized that it actually is a really effective tool. And we've really gone to a place of taking it to the next level. So, we'll talk about it a little bit more, and I'll give some client examples of how we've really used virtual leadership development to bring programs to life. And I think what we've heard from our clients is that this is going to continue long past some of the next phases. I think organizations that were maybe nervous, as Margo said, to start this journey during COVID are now realizing that this can be really a beneficial way to engage people if designed right. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that can look like. So just excited to continue the conversation about some of these pieces as we move into some of the upcoming slides. But again, really critical to focus on all these pieces as we move forward.
There's never been a more important time to focus on your culture and your leadership than now. So, finding those strategies to make it happen are going to be important. Over to you, Amalia, to take us into the next poll, I think. Why don't we kick that off, and then we will get into some Q&A from the audience.
Sounds good, Margo. Thank you. That brings us to our next poll. Which of the following resonates most for you? Just again, select one answer, please. Our organizational culture was strong pre-pandemic, and we're openly working on its evolution now. Our leaders are still figuring out what is expected from them in this new era. The world is different, but our leaders have naturally figured out how to be successful. It's clear that our culture needs to evolve, but there's no capacity to intentionally develop the related leadership capability. I can't get the executive team's attention to focus on culture and leadership skills yet. So just take a moment and please select the one that most resonates. And the answers are hopping in. And I think we're just about there, and I'll probably kick it over to Margo to just debrief what she sees. Thank you.
My first reaction is how great to see the smaller number around, not even being able to get any attention. Certainly every organization has its own context, but it's nice to see that the majority, are starting to be able to have some focus on it. I love to see that there's some pride in the organizational cultures pre-pandemic, and it just underscores again that that's been important in getting to where you are, but that you need to continue to work on its evolution. And the openness, I think, is so important about that particular statement, so that employees see that the organization will continue to evolve as our context is changing.
Thanks so much, Margo. Thanks for that reflection. All right, we're going to move into a part where we actually get to ask Cara and Margo some specific questions. We're going to also enable all of you to submit questions through the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screen. But first, what we'll do is just a couple of common questions that we get asked, and I'm going to direct this first one to Cara. So Cara, what new leadership capabilities have emerged recently, and how can we implement strategies to support their development?
That's a great question. Thank you, Amalia. So, as we've been talking and Margo's been taking us through the slides, I think we all recognize that the last 6 months or so through the pandemic has really been a significant emotional event. And I think what that means is leaders now more than ever are really called on to create hope, purpose and passion for their teams. And soft skills are more critical than ever. You know, Margo took us through that list, and there was a big long list of soft skills that leaders are required to demonstrate. And so we'll talk a little bit more here around some of the really critical ones that people will need to focus on in the months to come. You know, I think in the past, a lot of organizations focus on technical skills, and I think technical skills are still required, obviously, but they have become table stakes. And what we're hearing from organizations that we're working with, the best leaders through the pandemic over the last few months have really been those who've been able to go above and beyond and demonstrate compassion, empathy, balanced with decisiveness and great communication skills. And those became really critical to people really rising to the surface as the best leaders. You know, also data is showing us that 45% of people are suffering with mental health, and Margo touched on that in the earlier slides. So the role of a leader is really around helping to create trust and truth and making sure that people feel supported in the workplace. So I think that there are some 7 really core you know, capabilities that'll be critical to redefining leadership as we move forward. The first one really being around accountability. And I think that's still critical. You know, as we all know, results are important and people are accountable. But I think what's critical there is the balance of what we need to do as leaders to support people in being accountability. The second one is really around civility. And it's an interesting word that maybe we hadn't thought about before when we think about leadership development. But I think that leaders maybe and organizations have been underestimating this idea of civility, which really is around creating this environment of respect in the workplace. You know, if we look at organizations right now, there is a real lack of respect in the workplace being highlighted in the news and across many organizations. And this becomes a really critical skills for leaders just to create a safe space for employees where they feel comfortable and supported by their leaders. Compassion and empathy were ones that Margo mentioned earlier, and those really line up against emotional intelligence, which is quite critical. And I'll talk a little bit more about how organizations are focusing on this and how they're really deploying this in organizations and bringing it to life. Honesty, humility, and principle, and authenticity would be another one that should be on the list as well. Become really critical core capabilities that leaders will need, you know, to have and focus on going forward. You know, Amalia, in terms of kind of what are the implementation strategies to support these things, we've talked already about this idea or the notion of blended learning journeys. And I think it's really important to understand that we're on a bit of a journey here and that, you know, we can't necessarily address these things in an event, but that we really need to focus on a learning journey a lot of hands-on application inside the sessions and really focuses on back on the job. So we're making sure that everything that we're learning is taken back and is really practical for this day and age. The first thing that we would recommend always, and we've been working with our clients on, is shifting mindset first and foremost. Really starting with that mindset. And when we say that, what we mean is really around starting with some sort of an assessment. One that we've been recently deploying quite a bit of and using is really around an EQ assessment, helping people to just understand and build awareness around their emotional intelligence and helping to build that self-awareness. I think, you know, when we go on our learning journeys, one of the first steps to creating that mindset shift is just building awareness and understanding how am I showing up and who am I as a leader. We then typically move into skill set and we start moving into modules that will you know, support the application, and then really into deliberate practice. Some of the practical things that we're seeing around implementation when we think about virtual programming, or even when we're doing face-to-face, if there's some organizations that are back and people are back in the workplace, we're often seeing journeys that involve both a virtual component as well as a face-to-face. But what's really important, I think, is making sure that they're bite-sized and really applicable. So that when I say that, is making sure that the sessions are really less theory and more around building connection, having conversations, and more about application. I know one thing that we have learned over the last few months, the thing that people you know, repeatedly tell us that they find the most value in is really around the conversation, the storytelling, being able to hear from other leaders around things that they're going through. And I think it really speaks to some of those emotional intelligence pieces that we've identified as really critical, that becomes really important to people. The role of a senior leader is also so critical, making sure that senior leaders in your organization are also sharing their personal challenges and how they've overcome. People want to be able to hear from their senior leaders that they are also going through things and the steps that they've taken to overcome. And I think those are really critical as we think about creating that connection in that community inside of organizations. The next step really around implementation is sustainability. So as we all know with programs, it's so critical to not just have an event that ends, but to put in place pieces to support people as they go back to the role. So again, making sure that it's their leaders or their managers are there along the journey with them. Some things that we've done is really designing out digital toolkits or supporting mechanisms for their managers so that they can continue the conversation outside of the formal learning event. That becomes really critical. Accountability groups are often built in, and some of the best stories that I can see where we're seeing this working in organizations where the actual organizations are leading these accountability groups. So where senior leaders are coming in and they're discussing some of the challenges that they're going through after the program and how they're working, and that the senior leaders are actually coaches for participants going through the program. So those are some really good things to consider in terms of when you're designing programs and elements that you can put in. Another really important piece that we're seeing a lot of focus on right now is around coaching and one-on-one coaching. And we certainly have an on-demand app called Ezra, where our participants are actually, as part of going through their learning journeys, they also are provided with a one-on-one on-demand coach that really allows for just-in-time coaching when it's needed for them. And that's important if we think about sustainability when you're back on the job and you're faced with dealing with difficult situations, maybe having difficult conversations, performance conversations, all those things that leaders need to do, making sure that I have a coach that can help me through it and help reinforce the things that I maybe have learned throughout my learning journey. And then finally, what's really important, I think, in the implementation is really thinking about your evaluation strategies. You know, I think all organizations are really tied to metrics and results and scorecards, and oftentimes we don't do this for leadership development programs. And I think it's really critical for us to be able to show the shift in behaviors around some of the soft skills, and certainly this can be done. I think what's really important is to really think about this at the beginning of your program so that it's designed in. I think we often wait till the end of a program and then we wonder why it's difficult to measure, and what we're seeing is, and what we're seeing with the best organizations is we start this conversation at the beginning of the journey and it's designed in along the way so that we can measure and see the behavior shifts. Some just recent examples of clients that we're doing this well. We worked with some large banking clients that have co-created with us 6-month senior leader learning journeys, really focusing on the personal leadership capabilities that we've already talked about: compassion, empathy, creating an inspiring vision, coaching, accountability, collaboration. And all of the programs that we're seeing the best success with is really always starting with doing some sort of an assessment and really digging into that emotional intelligence in the EQ assessment, and then really spacing out virtual modules. What we would propose is never doing longer than about 2.5, 3 hours. Otherwise, it's just too much for people as they're trying to adapt and work in their workday. And then really the other key pieces that we're seeing success with some of these programs is, again, being supported by their leaders, making that deliberate. Don't just leave that to chance, design that in as part of the program. So there's a supporting program that aligns that for their leaders. And then again, this one-on-one coaching. And we see the same thing with another large manufacturing client that we've been working with that started on the program, pre-COVID, had planned to do the program face-to-face. And then in the midst of it had decided, we're going to go virtual. And that was certainly a challenge for them. I think there was some concern about, can we do this in a virtual way? And I'm happy to say that we've had really great success in the program thus far. And the participants are really getting a lot out of the program. And I think the key things to think about, again, are really practical modules, making sure that people have time for application, and also making sure that those senior leaders are involved along the way. And in this particular case with this client, the senior leaders were involved in all the design sessions. They really wanted to make sure that this program was the culture that they want to be, so that it was really designed around those pieces, and making sure that they also support in terms of the coaching and the accountability groups. So I know that was a long answer, but I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of, what are the leadership capabilities that people are focusing on? What kind of things can you do to implement the strategies? And then there was a few examples there of some clients that we're working with and some of the key pieces that they're focusing on. So over to you, Amalia.
Thank you so much, Cara. Thanks for that really fulsome answer. I really appreciated the way you highlighted for everybody the need to have such a holistic approach and kind of looking at all of the different points in the journey. So I think that was extremely helpful. And then just showing a couple of client examples. So thank you for that. I think everybody, if they had a notepad and a pencil, were probably writing furiously to capture all those points. Thank you. So over to Margo. I have a question for you, Margo. So many organizations are running so hard right now just to try to manage in the pandemic, and they haven't really given thoughtful time to what sort of initiatives will help them redefine their culture in the era that current and the one that's predicted to come, and then the sustainment afterwards. What are some of the ways that organizations can get the impact that they're looking for without having to embark on a massive consulting journey at great time and cost and expense to the organization? Love to hear you.
I think it's a great question, Amalia, and we do hear people say, we need to focus on it. We saw over 30% of you would love to have the capacity to do that, but for various reasons, it's challenging to do. For those who do have it, obviously, really being able to do a fulsome investigation of what is the culture that you need today and in the future to the best that we know, and where you see your current gaps and your strengths is a really important thing to do. So if you've got the capacity, certainly go for it. For other organizations that are stretched, and I see a couple of the questions that have coming in, there's a lot on our plates right now. So to take on something that's huge and expensive just doesn't make sense. So, taking advantage of the pulse surveys, of the engagement surveys, the data that you might already have access to about what's important, where people in the organization are really enthusiastic about what's been done and what values have been demonstrated, and where they still see that there are opportunities. So I know that there have been lots of surveys, certainly late about returning to work, others that have been really pulling the organization and getting a pulse on whether or not they feel that the organization is demonstrating inclusive and diverse practices and processes and seeing the results of that. So that data is rich, and being able to use that for multiple purposes is a really great way of moving forward. And then you can have some select interviews and focus groups as you need to fill in and around that and really create what you think are going to be the most important priorities, I guess, to focus on from a cultural perspective, or to make statements about what the organization's culture is and how you see that evolving in the future, right? That's a great place to start.
Thank you so much, Margo, and really agree that there's a lot to think about, and appreciate all the angles that you have presented. So we have a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm going to turn to Cara or Margo. They'll each have to be prepared to answer them. In the meantime, just before I do that, I just wanted to remind people that down in your Zoom toolbar at the bottom, there's a Q&A button. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please feel free to jot it down there, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. Thank you. And so one of the first questions is, if you had to focus all your priorities, given all the priorities that an organization has, if you had to really hone in on one thing to get started on this journey, I'm going to ask Cara, where would you suggest focusing your priorities based on what we've discussed so far? What would be a focal point?
Yeah, I think for me, and what I would really focus on as an organization is really defining what that culture needs to look like and what the behaviors are that need to line up against that. And I think that will be really critical, as every organization is quite different. We've talked a lot about these are the capabilities or the competencies that we think that you should focus on. But for some organizations, there might be some that are more critical to others. So I think that would be a really important first step. And then I think, if you were looking at a now, next, later strategy, which I always like to focus on that, is that, that may be the first step. I think, beyond that, if you had some more capacity to do that, I think it would be really critical to say, okay, what are the key things that we could do to really develop or bring these behaviors to life in the organization? And I think what's also really important, and sometimes we forget, is to start this work at the top of the house and really engage our senior leaders. You know, these programs really come into effect and really get the results that we're looking for when our senior leaders are demonstrating and leading the way on that. So I think, you know, the first step is really to identify, you know, what those critical behaviors that you will need to be successful going forward, and then potentially thinking about, is there some sort of program that we could focus on as an organization? What I'm seeing a lot of organizations focusing on right now, one area that I would focus on is coaching. And I think as organizations, you know, need to work through the next several months, and we really need to bring to life all those capabilities, building our internal coach strength becomes really critical. So I think, you know, understanding that there's a myriad of different capabilities that will be required, I think coaching could be one of the critical ones, starting with senior leaders first so that they can lead the way, that they can support the coaching culture and the transformation that perhaps needs to happen, and then rolling that down throughout the organization and really building that coaching mindset and skill set in the organization. And I think, you know, through doing that, you can bring a lot of those other capabilities to life, as well as really make sure that you're still delivering on results as well. Margo, if you would have more to add to that.
Well, I think we have a natural inclination to focus on those behaviors and those skills, and I totally agree with what you said, Cara. And just a reminder that there's more that you can do to support any kind of cultural shift. So if you're looking at more of a coaching culture, you're looking at more of an empathetic leadership style across your organization, for instance, developing those behaviors, absolutely essential. And then embedding that in the other processes, right? So what are you communicating about? What are the stories that you're telling? What are you reinforcing in the organization through your communications? And then what are you reinforcing through other policies, processes, and practices in the organization? And Amalia, I know we've worked with organizations where the statement over here, what the culture is and what it needs to be, when you actually start to dig away at it, is very different than what's, you know, coming up in terms of what are they actually developing in their leaders, and how is that actually being communicated in the organization. So it's that sort of threading it all the way through. And I think it's, you know, if you're trying to do things slim and, you know, really focused, pick one thing, but go all the way through the system with it, rather than try and pick 6 things and just scratch the surface with some Band-Aid solutions that may not actually be sustainable.
Thank you. And one of the things, some of the questions that are coming in, I'm going to weave my question through those questions and sort of back to you, Margo. So one of the things that people seem to be struggling a little bit with is balancing the need to get those priorities, establish them, which I'm going to ask you to comment on. How do you do that at the senior level, as well as balancing it with the need to be productive. And many people have commented just how much extra work people are doing during the pandemic. So despite the work from home fears that people weren't going to actually be attentive to their roles, in fact, we're finding the opposite. People never get away from their desks. Margo, is there anything you would suggest as a way to help get those priorities and establish that balance? Any thoughts you would share with the group?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no magic wand. If something needs to be done, it's going to take hard work. And it is a tough challenge today to carve out and create the space for something new. So I guess part of the solution is really, how do you see culture not as something that's an add-on or a nice to have, but actually, a fundamental part of your strategy for how you move forward, right? We're going to get through this. We want to make sure that we get through it with healthy, engaged employees that will stick with us. So that's really important. It can't be an add-on. It has to be an integrated part of it, and it has to be part of that overall work plan. And unfortunately, where you don't have the really senior executive sponsorship or attention to it for a variety of reasons, either they don't feel it's important or they just can't make the space for it. You can try and do it through other parts of the organization. It's just not going to be as quick or potentially as long lasting, right? But you can actually have some other activities that go on that through communications that are put out through other parts of the organization reinforce some of the cultural behaviors that you're looking for. You can still be doing some development. That doesn't necessarily require, you know, the CEO's blessing. That's going to reinforce some of these pieces, but it'll just be a little bit more sporadic until you can get the kind of holistic approach that you would look for in a more wholesome cultural shift.
Thank you. Thank you. Some interesting points. I don't know if Cara wants to build or if I can ask another question.
I was just going to add one piece onto that. I think right now, and I think, you know, we see this inside of many organizations we work with, there's so many priorities right now. And I think that's what we're hearing from you. And I think what becomes really critical for people is just to have a really clearly defined path and really minimize, these are our focus areas and these are the, you know, the top 5 things that we're going to be focusing on. And then just making sure that those things are really aligned to that culture that you're trying to drive. I think, you know, one of the things that can be really confusing for people is really having too many priorities. And we all know that if everything's a priority, then nothing is really a priority. So I would encourage people to, you know, you say, you know, we have so many things to work on, but to just get crystal clear with people about these are the things that we need to be focusing on, and then having the supporting pieces in place to support that from an perspective.
Thank you. And I was going to say, Cara, is there anything you could add to that in terms of like a tactical thing to bring that leadership team together? Is it a survey? Is it conversations? I think many people would love to hear about a really tactical way of getting that commitment from the leadership team. Anything either one of you would suggest?
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly do work with organizations to facilitate those kinds of conversations. And I think, you know, really getting on the table, what are all the different priorities? What are the things that people are working on? Helping really refine that list down, getting it really manageable, and making sure that you're focusing on the most important things that are going to, you know, drive your culture forward, both from a near term and then really still focusing on the long term. And I think over the last couple of months, as organizations have really been thinking and had to, made sense, they really were focusing on what was right in front of them, but really making sure that there's still the piece around focusing in the long term. And so really, I think doing those kinds of strategy sessions now and going into the fall and going into next year is a critical time. And I'm sure most of you are already doing that. And then really thinking about, as Margo said, how do you really roll that down through the organization? So it's one thing for the senior leaders to understand that, but really critical for everybody in the organization to understand how they feed into that. So as they're making decisions on what to do every day with their time, that they're focusing on the right things.
Thank you. An interesting question that's come in is, can you give an example of a change, a culture change that you have seen in the clients that we've worked with that shows a pre-pandemic culture, mid-pandemic culture, and even sort of something that's aiming towards a shift for the future? I don't know if either one of you would like to cite an example of an organization that you've worked with where you've actually seen some concrete change.
I'll just comment about one organization. I think it may not be exactly the response, but it was the work that they had done pre-pandemic to really pull their leadership team together. And I started to think about it during Cara's response. It's, you know, they did this great work as an executive team to really get aligned on what was important for the organization going forward, how they needed to work together, and set themselves up, I guess, in a way for whatever came their way, right? They'd already done some of that work about getting strongly aligned around what success looks like for them and how they're going to move forward together collectively. So that was really important. And you know, I've heard from multiple members of that team how important it's been for them in terms of making quick decisions and finding their path forward, not without conflict, because conflict is good, but in a way that they could move through it quickly to make a shift, you know, and go forward. So there's an element of that, and then being able to, again, if I think about this same organization, be able to shift very quickly from a very traditional in-person, in-office kind of environment to something that they're letting go, right? They're being bold about decisions around how long they're going to be away from the organization, and flexing different muscles in terms of how they lead for outcomes, not about face time or process, but really focusing on that outcome. And I only see that will continue into the future for them as being something that's really important.
Thank you. Thanks for the response. We have a couple more questions I'd really like to get to. There's some really interesting ones. So given, I'll just go maybe Cara to this one, given the importance of diversity and inclusion, is there a greater focus on developing cultural intelligence of leaders and employees?
Well, that certainly is something that we've been working with a lot of organizations right now on, is really creating that inclusivity environment and creating a space of belonging. And I think really where that starts is with your leaders, but I think it's with everyone in the organization. It needs to be part of, woven into the DNA of who you are as an organization. So typically the way that we're doing work in that space is, again, we start with senior leaders. I think whenever we can, if we can stop, and I noticed there was a question in here around what does it mean, or what does it look like when you say starting at the top? And what I mean by that is really starting with your executive team first and foremost, and making sure that they're also going through the program and that they're modeling the behaviors and they're speaking the language. And so when we think about creating that inclusivity and that space of belonging, we want our senior leaders to be really role modeling. We want to start seeing it put into play and into practices inside of our HR policies and programming. We want to see it inside of the organization. And then I think what's really critical while you're working with the senior leadership team to do that is rolling that down throughout the organization, all the way down to the front line, and really helping people not only to create the awareness, which I think is the first step in the journey around D&I, is understanding the awareness piece, understanding that we all have bias. And then what do I do with that then? How do I then translate that to create that into, when that happens for me, how do I create a space of belonging for others in my organization? So that becomes really critical, I think, as we're doing work in that space. And making sure that, again, this isn't an event. Making sure that this isn't just a one-stop, a session where we check the box and said we've done our diversity and inclusion session, but making sure that this becomes part of who you are as an organization. Like I said, weaving it into HR programs and policies, but continuing the conversation is also critical. And I think a lot of organizations where we see it really working well is where they're continuing the conversation on their own. We may run the programs inside the organizations for you. We may start the conversation and build awareness and give you the tools on mitigating some of the pieces, but it becomes really important for you to bring this in-house and just make it part of how you operate every day, and have senior leaders very involved in continuing the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Margo, I'm going to send this one over to you. One of the questions that's come up is around, how do you maintain the spirit of an organization, the human touch, this is a fun place to work, when in fact so many of us are now working virtually. How does that happen? And do you have any suggestions about either things you've seen with clients or even within our own organization?
Yeah, I think it's, one of the things that has struck me as I've listened to different organizations talk about what they're doing and seen seminars is to let the creativity of the team come out, right? Like, let it out. Send this out to the employees. They'll have terrific ideas about what really resonates for them. I've heard everything from virtual talent shows, family parties and celebrations where not only the employees, but their spouses and children are all invited into the camera's view, sending gifts, having cocktail hours. We've had trivia times. Whatever it is, it gives us a chance to not only talk about work, but to have a laugh, to try and recreate some of the after work drinks, or connecting in a cafe or a cafeteria at work over lunch, right? Mm-hmm. There are many different ways that we can do it. Outdoor gatherings and events, I've heard of those for smaller teams, obviously, where they can connect in a park nearby, maybe where they used to work, or in smaller communities in their neighborhoods. There's a multitude of ways, and I think what's interesting is the more as leaders we kind of let that go and let the employees and the teams find their own favorite ways to do it. It's natural, it's authentic, and it gives them a chance to connect that way.
Thank you. I find that really what you've emphasized there is almost the need to be innovative and creative in staying connected in different times. And so that's been the challenge. But I think, as you pointed out, many organizations have stepped up to it. We probably have time for Oh, go ahead.
Just gonna add one thing to that. I think the other thing is that we're starting to, it's been a long time, and so we're tired, right? And so initially we had a whole lot of things and parties, and I think personally, as well as what I'm hearing from others, is that there's a sense of fatigue about how do we keep the pace up. And we know that if anything's going to be sustained, you have to keep focused on it, right? So maybe it naturally evolved early on, and it's time to put some more formality and some structure around it. So you've got somebody who's actually just going to make sure it happens.
Thank you.
So
and I have, I'm going to combine two questions. This will probably be about our last as we're wrapping up here, but let's see if we can squeeze in one more after this one. So these ones are, I'm weaving two together here. Cara, I'm going to throw this one your way. And I'll just read it because I like the way it's phrased here. Leadership in the past was often synonymous with managers, senior managers, but being more remote means everyone needs to be a leader in their own work. How do you get employees who are more used to that command and control environment to actually be working to self-direct and self-guide? So that's the question. And then somebody else also comments on, do we need to teach leaders or people to have a growth versus a fixed mindset? So I'm going to kind of combine those two things and get your perspective on that one. Thank you.
That's good. I think those are great questions, and they actually, I think, are really connected. So let's start off with just the growth and the fixed mindset. I think, first of all, I said in organizations, I think all individuals need to really have that growth mindset. And I think you're right. I think everyone is a leader, whether you're in a formal manager type of a role or you're an individual contributor. And so I think that growth mindset will really help with that piece around understanding that I'm accountable and that I don't need necessarily my leader always to be guiding me and leading the way. I think some of the ways that you can do that, for example, we've talked quite a bit about coaching, and I think coaching can really bring that to life for individuals, where we really deploy a coaching approach with our teams, where we move away from this idea of telling people what to do, but we really move into the space of helping people really have some autonomy, feel like they're empowered to do the right things. And I think that coaching can certainly bring that to life. As we focus on leaders and we focus on developing kind of that growth mindset, I think it almost in some way starts with the leaders, helping them to really understand that, as we moved into leadership and manager type roles, we were great at our jobs, and I think we felt like we needed to have all the answers. And leaders now need to move to a space where they recognize that their team actually has the answers, and their role is really to bring the best out of their team and inspire them to be great in those areas. And so the more that we focus on leaders and we focus on developing that growth mindset in them, having passion and empathy, focusing on those pieces that we talked about as we went through those slides about the core capabilities, I think we'll start seeing that come through with them. I think it's up to the managers and formal managers to create space for people to be able to show up in that way and step up. Margo, would you add something to that?
No, I think that's terrific. If we want to get to the next question, I'm going to just let it go right back to you for that last one.
Okay, so the very last question before we have to wrap up is just asking about how are leaders to be monitored, if we're all results driven in the face of what we're going through currently. How can we measure their success in doing what they're doing around pushing the new agenda around culture and leadership?
Yeah, that's, I'll kick it off a little bit. Some things are going to have to remain stable in terms of the approach around measurement. You set your objectives, you're measuring around results, and still paying attention to the process, because nobody wants to get results at the cost of people or the process that goes into it, right? So there are some things, and I'm just looking at the time, we could have a whole other conversation around performance management and performance measurement and how do you do that. It's the one-on-one connection, it's using your listening and your communication skills to set, goals and objectives that can be worked through. And then just keeping on top of them, right? So some of those same basic principles that we've had in the past, applied through Zoom, revisited regularly, perhaps even more regularly than you might have in a different situation.
Okay, thank you.
I would just quickly just add one piece onto that. I think if we're used to a formal performance management process where maybe we just do the touch-ins and once or twice a year, now more than ever becomes really critical to have the ongoing conversation. And, in an informal way to have people really talk about their progress and their results and making sure that people are accountable. So that, I think, now more than ever, and with technology, Zoom, we have all, Adobe Connect, WebEx, there's all kinds of ways to create connections and have those kinds of conversations. So I would encourage people to do that.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank both Margo and Cara so much for their answers, and all of you for the terrific questions, because it's really generated for us at least some very interesting points of discussion. And I think we're going to have to wrap at this point. So again, just thank you so much for attending the webinar, and a copy of the recording will be sent to you following the webinar. So have a great day, and thanks again.
Bye.